Corey Brada here at Iowa, the voice of college football, and Mark Rogers, his main channel here at the voice of college football. I'm joined by former Iowa offensive coordinator Don Patterson. And Coach, this has been a show you and I have both been looking forward to doing. It's got nothing to do with Iowa directly. So anybody who's tuning in here and sees the show name as Iowa Live, don't worry. We're not talking Hawkeyes tonight. We're talking about the biggest game in college football, which, of course, is the national championship game between Georgia and Alabama. First of all, I want to ask you, Coach, why does breaking down, you did a lot of hard work heading into this show, and it's not just to grace our listeners here at the Voice of College Football, but why does a matchup like this intrigue you so much to where you're going to do the extra work even though you're not coaching in it?
Well, I did it 2 years ago for the first time. There's a group here in Iowa City called the Monday Morning Quarterback Club, I think they call themselves, and they asked me to speak. I'm very honored. I'm an honorary member of the quarterback club, and they had asked me to speak, and they said, "When would you like to speak?" And I said, "Well, our season's done, so what about maybe the day of the national championship game?" And they thought it was a good idea, so I did the research on it, and I was kind of intrigued anyway. I don't even recall who played 2 years ago, to be honest with you, Corey, because it's always about the most recent game, the upcoming game. So I don't remember too much about what the other analytics were because they don't relate to tomorrow night, of course. So anyway, I'm going to speak to them tomorrow at noon and try to give them a little more enjoyment tomorrow night when they watch the game, so they have a little better idea of what to look for and be able to zero in on those things that matter the most.
It's a Joe Burrow game 2 years ago.
Yeah, he's a good one. He's doing well even in the pros.
Absolutely. I got to ask you, before we get down to the nitty-gritty, and our caller line is open. We're at the main phone line. You see at the bottom of the screen, 860-499-3332. You're welcome to give us a call. But I want to talk, first of all, before we get into the playoff, and specifically the title game, I got a good friend who's a Steelers fan, Don, and I don't know if you caught Baltimore and Pittsburgh earlier today. But the scenarios with this, we haven't seen it play out a lot like this, but the scenarios for a team like Pittsburgh to try to get into the playoffs, and then you see LA, the Chargers, and the Raiders tonight, their situation. Have you ever seen anything quite like what the situation is? And shouldn't this make us want to change the overtime rules in the NFL?
Yeah, I think I do know what you're talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong. Pittsburgh is in unless these two teams that play tonight tie.
And if right? they tie, Don, they're both in.
They're both in, yeah. So they could simply take a knee all night long and tie 0-0 and go to the playoffs.
Listen, I understand there's a moral side to the game and an ethical side, but the name of the game is winning, and you and I both know. Somebody brought up to me earlier today, well, why wouldn't they just play and say, may the best team win? Because it's a lot easier to just say, hey, we'll both get in, and we don't have to really risk not winning.
Right.
It's just a weird situation. I've never heard of a situation where basically the last game of the week, you have a situation where the only way both of the teams get in is if they tie. And again, I was thinking about that earlier today as I was reflecting on the NFL overtime rules versus college football overtime rules. And I was thinking to myself, why do we even have overtime in the NFL? What's the point of overtime? If we're going to have ties, why not just end it at the end of regulation, Don? What's the point of overtime?
Well, you're right. This is one time where I believe the college has got it right, and the pros are the ones that are lagging behind. The solution's kind of obvious to me. There should be no more ties in the NFL. And the only question, of course, is how you're going to resolve the games then.
But we can also agree, Don, that the college overtime right now, as it stands, is probably not perfect either.
Absolutely. I said all along, Corey, this bothered me a few years ago when the overtime rules went into effect. You had a case of a quarterback. Let's just give you an example. Quarterback setting a new school record with eight touchdown passes in one game. Then when you look into it, he threw 4 of them in overtime. And so I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. Another example, what if you have a defense like Georgia's, and you work so hard established an incredible record in terms of scoring defense. And now all of a sudden you're in an overtime game and you only gave up 10 points in regulation, but at the end of the game, you've given up 31, because they scored 3 touchdowns in overtime. That seems absurd, doesn't it? That a team that in regulation gave up 10 points would get charged with giving up 31 simply because of 3 overtimes. I know you could argue that they could stop them in overtime, but let's face it, the overtime rules are set up so that it's going to come to a quick resolution, and usually that resolution involves making touchdowns. They give you the short field of 25 yards. And even when the rule first went in, Corey, my thought was, don't make it so easy to score. I think it would be a better rule right now, honestly, if you started on the plus 40. Because now it's not even a given that you're going to get in field goal range. Maybe you win in overtime with a field goal. And maybe it does go to a second overtime simply because neither one scored. I think that's okay. But I think it would be a more fair representation of what happened that day. And you'd still come to a quick end, I think. And obviously, this crazy solution, think back to that Penn State game against Illinois.
Yeah.
Pretty obvious. That's not a great rule.
I loved the game, though, Don. It was fun to watch.
Yeah.
I enjoyed watching it. I mean, it was so surreal watching these teams when ABC's not going to break or whatever channel it was on, and you see the teams walking from one side of the field to the other side of the field, just back and forth every other play.
Yeah, and isn't it hard to imagine that you could fail that many times on 2-point plays? Because I think there were, I don't know how many failed 2-point plays, all one after another, right? Each team, They both failed.
9 overtime occasions. Right? Yeah, broke the record for overtime, and probably not rightfully so. But anyways, I digress. I figured I'd just bring up the situation with the Chargers and the Raiders, because I'm sure some of our listeners will have our preview show on one screen and NFL Sunday night on another screen. So we understand that. And again, last week of the season, I will ask you one more thing about the NFL, Don. How do you feel about the extra game, the 17th game that was instituted this year?
I don't like that either. I heard today any number of season records were broken today.
Right.
Well, yeah, they played an extra game. So they both broke someone's record that did it in 16 games, and they had a 17th game to break the record. It seems silly to me that you would change. The only reason I can think of that they changed is simply so they could pay their bills a little bit better. And so do you really need to make $5 million a year as an NFL player? Isn't $4.5 million enough? It seems silly to me that you'd have 17 games in the regular season.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about this matchup. All right, Alabama, Georgia, the rematch. I know that if you talk to the average college football fan, this is not the matchup that a lot of people wanted. I'm sure if you're a Georgia or Tide fan, you're just fine with this matchup, and certainly the SEC is well represented, and we can talk about whether this SEC matchup is good or not for college football. I don't think it is. But regardless, this is an intriguing storyline because it's not often that you have a rematch. And I didn't do this research beforehand, and this is one thing I forgot to do, Don, I will admit. But do you know the data, and I'm sure Mark does, the data on how many times there has been a rematch in – there probably has never been a rematch since we've had a title game, correct?
That's correct. This is the first one.
So what does that do is when you did the analytics for this game, how much weight do you give to the SEC championship game when you're analyzing parameters that are key to victory in this one?
Yeah, let me begin, Corey, by going over some research here. And if you'll allow me to do that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely.
First off, pardon me while I actually read some of this as text, just to give you a little background about the game. Starting in 2008, Alabama's won the last 7 matchups against Georgia. 4 of those losses have occurred since Kirby Smart became the head coach. So Georgia's had a lot of difficulty against Alabama, as most of your listeners know. And as you know, Corey, they don't even necessarily play each other very often. They're in separate divisions within the SEC, and they're not a chosen rival, whatever that's called, a crossover rival. Each team has one crossover rival that they play each and every year. Georgia's crossovers against Auburn, as I recall, and Alabama's is against Tennessee. So they don't play very often. Of course, they're very likely to play in the SEC championship year after year because they're both so good. But Georgia's body of work this year over the entire regular season, it's safe to say it's been more impressive than Alabama's. Let me give you an example. Their only one-score win over the entire season was on opening day. It was a 10-3 game against Clemson. It actually, incidentally, was played at a neutral field. It was played in Charlotte, and I don't even believe that the same quarterback started the game. I don't know who started the game. I didn't check, but anyway, it was a 10-3 game that went Georgia's way. The next closest game over their entire regular season happened to be in midseason, and the reason I bring it up, it was against Kentucky. It was a 30-13 win over Kentucky that was played at Georgia. And obviously Kentucky gave them a competitive game. But here's what's amazing about their regular season. They outrushed all 12 regular season opponents. They won the second quarter scoring against all 12 of those same opponents. And they had more defensive sacks than each and every one of those opponents also. That's pretty amazing. To give you an idea, Corey, as you know, I look at each game in terms of 25 different parameters. And obviously, when you get down below those first 15, the winning percentages are dropping on down. And incidentally, I have those all listed in terms of Big Ten games. I haven't gone to the trouble of breaking down all SEC games, of course. That'd be a monumental amount of work. But I do know how the Big Ten parameters all fell out a year ago. And I simply use that same model for the SEC teams that are playing tomorrow night. But it's safe to say those top 15 parameters in the Big Ten, a lot of those same parameters would show up, maybe in a different order, but they'd show up in the top 15 for the SEC also. So just zeroing in on those top 15 parameters, the average breakdown in each game, if it was a Georgia game, typically Georgia won 12 of those 15 parameters on average. The opponent won exactly 2, and there was 1 tie. So if you can imagine,
for anybody who's not, when you're running analytics, right, Don, that's an outstanding, obviously. I mean, they're number 1 throughout the year for a reason, but that's a astonishingly good number.
Yeah. I guess if you win 12 out of 15 parameters and there's 1 tie and the other team wins 2, I guess that means you win by, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 touchdowns. Yeah. Because that was a typical Georgia game this year. So that was a really impressive body of work over the entire season. And then, as you know, of course, they looked awfully good against Michigan, too. Incidentally, Michigan didn't win a single parameter out of those top 15. They were 0 for the top 15 parameters. So a really, really high level of play. By comparison, if you look at all 15 parameters in each and every game that involved Alabama, on average, they won 10 parameters. The opponent won 4 parameters. And that left an average of 1 tie in there also. So that gives you an idea that over the entire season, you have to be more impressed with the body of work on the part of Georgia. And yet, when they played in the SEC championship game, which was 5 weeks and a day ago, none of that mattered, of course, because Alabama managed to win by 17, you might recall, 41-24. Let me just touch on Alabama's regular season. Not as impressive as Georgia, that's true. They had a 41-38 loss at Texas A&M that you're very familiar with, because I know you mentioned A&M's quarterback a time or two on air, and rightfully so. I was very impressed with how he played that night.
Yeah.
But beyond that loss, the Crimson Tide has no less than 4 other games that were 1-score wins for Alabama. So one of which was an overtime game, you might recall, against Auburn. That wasn't very long ago, just a few weeks ago. But as you know, none of that mattered when they beat Georgia 41-24 in the championship game. So knowing all that as background, that's the background of the 2 teams. So what I did, I looked at all 12 regular season games for both teams. I then also added in the semifinal games that were played, of course, against Michigan and Cincinnati. So I took those 13 games and I looked at them in terms of 25 parameters per game. So that's 325 evaluations on each team for a total of 650. And believe me, some of them take a lot of time to do. Some of them are easy, but others are very time consuming. But it's just the right way to do it. And what I'm looking for after I did all that, Corey, I simply wanted to take the 26 games that were all part of that regular season plus the semifinal games, and I wanted to look at them independently of Georgia versus Alabama. So I took those 26 games and I simply asked the question, in those 26 games, if you won the parameter, did you in fact win the game? No surprise to you, there were several of them that came out very, very high. I was selfishly hoping one of them would be 26-0, which would be an indication to me whoever wins that parameter probably does win the game, because It's been 100% reliable in predicting the winner. None of them hit 100%, but there were no less than 5 of them that were somewhere between 92 and 88%. And just to give you an idea of the records, and it included every last game, the best record of all was 24 wins and 2 losses. That's an awfully high finish, 92% win. Then there were a couple of 23-3 records in those 26 games. And then beyond that, there were a couple of 21-3 records in those games also. A couple of ties, of course, in those parameters that had a winning record of 21-3. So those are all between 88 and 92% win. After doing that, after looking at all 26 games, I then simply added those together. And I'll give you a specific example. I won't even tell you what the count is, but on this page, can I show you this page? Give you a quick glance just to give you an idea of how it all works. Maybe it doesn't show up.
Yeah. Nope, we can see it just fine.
But anyway, you got the parameter in the left column. Then you got the Bama games and the record in all those games based on one single isolated parameter. Then you got the Georgia games in the next column. Then I've simply added them together to come up with 24 out of 26 or 21 out of 24, whatever the case might be. And then I looked at which ones had the highest winning percentage. There were 5 of them out of the 25 that really stood out. And then I simply, after I'd done all that, then and only then did I go back and look at Alabama versus Georgia. And it won't surprise you to hear this. Alabama versus Georgia in those 25 categories, Alabama won 13 of those parameters. Georgia won 11. So kind of what you'd expect among an evenly matched couple of teams. It'd be really evenly divided. It was one tie, of course. So that was very even. Here's the part that surprised me. The 5 parameters that stood out the most were all won by the same team. And no surprise to you, Corey, that team was Alabama. That made me very uncomfortable knowing I was going to come on the air and talk to you about it, because I wanted to give Alabama credit for maybe having some idea as to what those parameters were. Pretty amazing that if they only won 13, what are the odds that the best 5 would all go to Alabama?
So let me just put this in perspective, and we do have a couple calls. I know for our callers, hang tight here. We are going to get your call in just a moment. But Don, I just want to put this in perspective for, again, people that don't really follow analytics and are kind of having to wrap their minds around this. So how often is it that, and maybe you don't have this data, but just, I guess, off the top of your head, how often would it be that 2 teams that you would say are probably pretty evenly matched on paper heading into a game like the SEC championship game, how often would you say one of those teams wins all 5 of the top 5 parameters?
It would be rare. It would be very rare.
In other words, it would be fair to assume that potentially Nick Saban and that staff made a concerted effort to hit those parameters, which of course means that they have, I mean, obviously they have access to the same data, but they were probably very well familiar with those parameters.
It's entirely possible. Now, just to put it all in perspective, I'm sure of this. They played that championship game 1 week later than when they finished their regular season, right?
Right.
So they're really in a time crunch. To give you the listeners an idea, this research here represents, I can look at one game, 25 parameters. If I'm really on top of my game, I can maybe knock out a game in 30 minutes. So the reason I bring it up, those 26 games have taken something at least along the lines of 13 or 14 hours to do. It's time consuming to do it. And that's just the raw data. Then you got to go back and analyze it and all that. So it's time consuming. But I do have an idea that Nick Saban has more than just 10 full-time assistants working for him. There are people there that are affiliated with Alabama football, and I don't doubt that Georgia has the same thing, that have other responsibilities other than just on the field coaching. And it would involve breaking down film. When I say breaking down film, that means, of course, evaluating what's happening and throwing it all in the computer to get a good indication of what's going to happen on any given down and distance. But then beyond that, the analytics I'm talking about is something different than that, of course, because it involves looking at all these games. And I promise you, Alabama and Georgia, neither one is probably scouted at all 13 opponents that have shown up in all these games. Logically, they probably pay more attention to what happened in the game 5 weeks ago, head to head. But it has crossed my mind. It's pretty amazing that Georgia could win all 5 of the top parameters, realizing that the other 20 parameters were very evenly divided up, as we've already discussed.
We do have a couple. I'm going to interject here just for a moment, Don. We've got our caller on wait. We do have a couple calls for you. Thank you for calling our CFP National Championship Game preview here at the Voice of College Football. Who's on the line?
Hello, Corey. This is Jared the actor from Madison, Wisconsin.
How are you, Jared the actor?
Doing great tonight. A lot of fun. You and Don, I want to keep that band together for as long as we can because you guys are a lot of fun to listen to.
I appreciate that. We appreciate hearing that.
So I have a question in terms of the Big Ten versus SEC. Yeah.
It's always a heated topic.
You and Mark Rogers go back and forth on this.
Yeah.
But, Iowa won the West this year, and then they played Michigan, and the Michigan smoked them. Was it 43-3?
42-3, but who's counting?
Yeah, but then Michigan played Georgia, which is the class, I think, of the SEC, and they got destroyed. Do you think the Big Ten is that far behind the SEC, or what are your thoughts on that?
Don's shaking his head. First of all, you can't play the transitive property with college football, right, Don? But, I mean, SEC fans would say the opposite because they would use the reasoning that Jared the actor just did, and the fact that you've got two teams. Here's how I would simplify it, all right? And I'm not the first person to say this. To me, top to bottom, the Big Ten is actually the better conference. Now, Mark doesn't agree with me. That's fine. I know he's got some data to support his claim. But the SEC is better at the top, Don. They've got more teams that are ready to compete for national championships than the Big Ten does. Certainly, I think that was proven with Michigan. Now, Ohio State, I think Michigan and Ohio State were clearly the two best teams in this conference, Don. But how would you answer that question?
Well, I would simply point out that the Big Ten plays 9 conference games. The SEC only plays 8. A lot of people aren't aware of that. And what they do with those other 4 games is schedule 4 teams they can beat. I'd be curious. Go back and look at the win-loss record involving those. Let's say it's 14 teams. I'm going to do that. That's 14 teams times 4 games apiece. That's 56 games. What do you think the win-loss record is in those 56 games? It might be. It's not 56-0, of course, because you got people like Vanderbilt that mess things up. But the point is, a lot of those SEC teams went 4-0 this year. I promise you. And so you simply want to fatten up your win-loss record, and to play 4 non-conference games is a good idea because you're halfway toward an 8-win season, and of course, an 8-win season is classified as being a pretty good season. If you're 8-4, people think you're pretty good. Well, half of them might have been against teams that weren't very good at all.
Don, we talked about heading into the Citrus Bowl. Kentucky played one of the worst schedules in the FBS by a lot of metrics. And some of the reasoning, and again, I'm not just pushing back on Mark. Mark is he's got a vast knowledge of college football, and I will never try to claim that I have nearly what he has as far as head knowledge. But I will say this. You can use the claim that Kentucky played, the likes of South Carolina and Louisville. And now Louisville, again, I'm bringing up them. They're in the ACC. But South Carolina, for example, like you just brought up, you're scheduling 4 non-conference games. Even if you have one difficult game in the non-conference, you're halfway to bowl eligibility by means of McNeese State and, South Carolina A&T.
And I believe I'm familiar with the name Mercer, because
I believe that was that Bama this year?
One of these two teams played Mercer. I forget which one it was.
It's usually Bama that plays Mercer, right? I know we're kind of going off on a tangent, Jared, but my simple response, and again, there's a lot of numbers to hash out here. I think the Big Ten is better top to bottom. I know, certainly the start to bowl season had a lot of people raising their eyebrows, and that evened out. And then, of course, again, SEC fans or homers are going to use the playoff as an example as to why the SEC is better. I think it's a fair debate to have. I don't think there's this huge gap either way. And I think, again, if you're an SEC fan, you're going to claim the SEC is better. What are your thoughts, Jared?
Well, I will say, top to bottom, they're very comparable, SEC versus Big Ten. But, we watched that Purdue Tennessee game, right? Yeah. And, those are two, middle tier teams of both conferences. And they clashed, and it was a very good game. So yeah. I think, in that realm, it's about the same, but you get the top tier, the SEC kind of wins every time. It's just my opinion.
Yeah, well, it has in recent time. I mean, and again, so that's what we're talking about. Are we talking about top heaviness, or are we talking about balance and equality? I mean, certainly Vanderbilt is everybody makes fun of Rutgers every year, Don, but Vanderbilt is a perfect example of a school that does absolutely nothing in that conference, and yet nobody seems to call out. And then again, scheduling, we've talked about that. So there's a claim to be made both ways, and I think it's a fair debate. This year that would kind of lend itself to have that discussion. Is this all SEC national championship game good for college football, Don? Because I don't think it is.
Yeah, I can see why you say that. It would be nice if two different conferences were represented in the championship game. Not to take anything at all away from Georgia and Alabama. You've heard me say part of the problem with a 4-team playoff is that you get the same 4 teams all the time. And typically, in terms of how often they've shown up in the Final Four, it has been traditionally, it's been Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma, right? Georgia's been in there a little bit. Notre Dame's been in there a little bit. But in general, you get a lot of the same teams. So this particular year, I would say it's not surprising at all that both Georgia and Alabama made it to the Final Four, because even preseason, a lot of people had them picked among the top 4 teams. Probably almost all the experts pretty much did. And then beyond that, of course, people thought Ohio State would probably be in there. Maybe some had Oklahoma listed there all over again, because that typically is what happens on an average year. That's all the reason, as we've discussed, Corey, to not go to 12 teams and give 4 teams a bye, because you'd have those same 4 teams more often than not winning the byes. So the better solution, if we're ever going to expand, is to go from 4 to 8. And then at least everybody's got to play the equal number of games. And those teams that have a hard time getting in the top 4, at least they have a chance to prove it on the playing field that they deserve to have a shot at a national title, even if they had difficulty getting into the Final Four.
Yeah, I know that no concrete answer from me, Jared. I do think that the conferences are close, but does that hopefully answer your question?
Yeah, it certainly did. Thanks, Corey. You and Don are quite the tag team, and I love listening to you guys. So I'll let you go, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Always appreciate the call. All right. We do have another caller here. Thank you for calling the Voice of College Football. Who's on the line?
Your old buddy, Minnesota Dave.
Minnesota Dave. All right. What are your thoughts on the big game tomorrow?
How's it going, Corey and Don?
Oh, we're just ecstatic.
I think that I really feel that Georgia might pull this one off. I think it's very hard to beat the same team twice.
I think there's some truth to that, Don.
Opinion on.
We've talked about that. It is difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I know Mark ran the numbers on rematches in important games over the course of even just the playoff era, but even back into the 80s and 90s. And typically it is hard for a team to beat a team twice. But again, I would love to go back now that you have not shared those with us yet, but those top 5 parameters, I would be interested to see if any of those initial meetings of those in those seasons where there was a rematch that occurred, if during those initial meetings there was ever a team that won all of the parameters and was that dominant, because that was the score really maybe didn't even tell the whole story. That was a pretty dominant win for Georgia, or excuse me, for Bama during the title game. So I'd be interested to compare that to past rematch seasons.
Yeah. When you look at the stats from that SEC championship game, even though Alabama won some of those all important top parameters, the edge was not very much at all. I'll give you an example. I don't want to divulge everything I know, but I'll divulge a little bit. I've already mentioned, so impressive that Georgia was able to do this. They outrushed all 12 regular season opponents. Well, they also outrushed by a long shot, outrushed Michigan. So now they're 13-0 in their 13 games I looked at, in addition to, of course, the championship game. They're 13-0. It won't surprise you to learn then that maybe rushing yardage is one of those 5 parameters. It is. I don't mind admitting that that's one of the 5. I'm not going to divulge them all, but I'll divulge that one since I've already mentioned that Georgia outrushed every last opponent going into the Alabama game. Alabama did outrush Georgia, but only by a few yards. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but by 10 yards maybe. Not very much yards. At all. 6 yards.
Yeah.
So even though they outrushed them, it wasn't a dominant performance in terms of running the football. It was very much an even game there too. But
Don, here's a fair point. Yakov22 brings this up on the screen here that everyone in Georgia's front 7 is between a first and third round NFL pick, and that may not pan out. But with as dominant as that front 7 is for the Bulldogs, I'm shocked that I shouldn't say shocked, but the fact that Brian Robinson Jr. was able to average 3.5 a carry, that is impressive. The points put aside, just the fact that they were able to get over 100 yards rushing as a team is impressive.
Yeah, and even though they didn't run up and down the field on them, they kept them very honest, obviously, which again, as you know, sets up play action passing. And another reason they won the game, of course, they got some big chunk plays. Incidentally, Corey, I know I thought of you today as I was watching it. Did you by any chance see Green Bay and Detroit play today?
I did not.
Well, you're probably aware now that Detroit beat them, right?
I am.
And, of course, you'd say, well, I bet Aaron Rodgers didn't play the whole game either. No, he played maybe half of it, not even half. I can't remember. Green Bay did not have to win the game, but here's my point. One big reason Detroit beat them is their first 2 touchdowns were both exotics. I thought you'd want to know that. Trick plays that somehow even worked against the Green Bay Packers. So here's that old trick play issue rearing its ugly head again. Sure enough, it's a good way to win football games. It's not a sign of weakness to run trick plays. It's a sign of intelligence. And Detroit ran them today, and they both worked for touchdowns.
And let's be honest, Don, Michigan had success against Iowa doing that, and Georgia had some success against Michigan doing that.
Yeah.
So I hate to go off on a tangent on you, Minnesota Dave. But you called in probably to ask a question.
I have a couple more questions. Just
sure.
Wanted to say, did Iowa pick up any quarterbacks in the transfer portal?
Oh, I'm just so shocked. We got 35 minutes into the show before that topic came up.
Because I know Minnesota picked up. They picked up one offensive lineman from Notre Dame. The kid originally from Eden Prairie. His dad used to be a Gopher.
Yeah.
And I think they picked up a defensive player from Vanderbilt that decided to come here. And I just wanted to know who. Did you guys pick up anybody? Did you lose anybody? Or because I know we lost Thomas, the running back. So
yeah.
I don't know where he went. Or I think I don't know where. I know he's in the transfer portal. I don't know if he's already been picked up.
Yeah, he was picked up, wasn't he? Kai Thomas was. Where did he go? Maybe he wasn't picked up already. I don't see a commitment. I could be wrong on that. But yeah, he entered the portal. No, Iowa has not gotten any commitments from anybody. I know they're in the top 5 for a kid from Cornell to play tackle, which would be big. But they're not attached to any quarterbacks in the portal, as far as what I've heard. I am not a member of the media, and so I don't feel like I have quite the limits for what I promote. I've been a big advocate these last 48 hours for Iowa to go after Jaden DeLora from Washington State. But anyways, no, I have not heard anything about quarterback portal. I mean, not really much as far as a portal in general. The only real action that I've heard is the kid from Cornell. But I did see the Minnesota, the fact that Minnesota was able to get the kid from Notre Dame is big, because y'all are losing some stuff up front on a really good offensive line.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why we went after him. We need more big guys up front. That's going to be the big thing with us. That offensive line was just absolutely huge, and especially when you're losing a tackle that's about almost 400 pounds, and it's about he's what, according to some people say he's 7 foot, or some people say he's 6'9", but he's just a huge boy.
Yeah,
you're
right.
Kid from Melbourne, Australia.
Yeah, no, they got some pieces to replace, but there's still time. The portal is going to be very, very active, and then it gets active after spring. So there will be a number of kids that I'm sure, Iowa's actually taken advantage of the transfer portal during the summer in the past. So we'll see.
All right. And my other thing to say is I do think that the Big Ten is getting closer to the SEC in talent, but I do think I agree with you that from top to bottom, I think the conference is more even. We do play a lot more tougher games, at least non-conference wise. And I think that there's a lot of course, a lot of ESPN and media bias for the SEC. I just don't feel like every time, I just can't stand every time they talk about our conference sort of still being far from where the SEC is, wherever,
You can say who you're talking about. You're talking about Paul Feinbaum, correct? I mean, we can just be outward with that, right? Yeah. You're talking about Feinbaum. Yeah, he's just a talking head. That's just what he is. Not that I'm not, but no, he's a huge homer, and but he's doing his job great, man. He's a great promoter.
Oh yeah, he is. He is a great promoter, but if I bet you anything though, if the Big Ten network was picked up by ESPN instead of Fox, it would be a different story.
You're probably right, sir.
Yeah. But you guys have a nice night, and I'm gonna go back to I have to go back to work anyways. Right now, I work at one of the best campuses in the Big Ten, so I'll talk to you later.
All right, stay warm, Minnesota Dave. Take care.
All right, see you later. Bye-bye.
All right, and I think that's a fair conversation to have. I don't mind talking about the whole conference versus conference debate, Don. Of course, we're talking specifically about a huge game tomorrow that happens to feature 2 SEC teams. So I don't want to be disingenuous to the conference, which has earned these 2. I mean, there's no question. The SEC not only got 2 teams into the national championship game, Don, but it was dominant in doing so. Neither of those games were close. The semifinals time up.
Just for the record, of course, and especially in the case of Georgia, none of the SEC teams played Georgia close either. So, they were dominant against all kinds of SEC teams. And they certainly deserved that number 1 ranking that they had at the end of the regular season. It didn't last long when they played Alabama, but at least they were an incredible season, 13-0, and 12 of them were really decisive wins.
We do have another call here for you, Coach. Thank you for calling the Voice of College Football, our CFP National Title Preview. Who's on the line?
Hey, Corey. Hey, Don. It's Still Real MVP. How you guys doing this evening?
How are you, sir? Well, I think we're doing okay. I think I can speak for Don on that.
Well, I'm great that we got to see the national championship game tomorrow, but I'm also saddened because I know it's the end of the regular season. So.
Yeah, we were getting for a while. We were getting one game after the title game. Remember that, Don?
Mm-hmm.
We get one bowl game after, which I always thought was so weird. What a weird setup. I think it's weird that we got the Texas Bowl on Tuesday. I thought that was just a strange dynamic, but I was happy to see
the New Year's
win.
Bowl games. Yeah.
Say it again, Don.
The Texas Bowl after the New Year's Bowl games. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right.
An odd time.
Bizarre.
Right. If it was, in my opinion, they should have used that date for postponed bowl games.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. That's a whole nother conversation. I still don't understand why we were canceling bowl games. What are we doing here, Don, that we can't reschedule games for early January? What's the problem with that?
I have no idea other than I don't know. I don't know why they couldn't reschedule. You're right. Is it that hard to reschedule a charter to get you to the game site? And maybe one problem would be if you're using a high school's facilities when they go back to school after the first of the year, maybe that's a problem, and that it's easy to use their facilities when it's Christmas holidays, and maybe nobody's excited about letting you use their facilities beyond the first of the year.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask Don about the Georgia game, and I'm sure he's got the stats on this, but when Georgia pressured Alabama, they were able to get when they blitzed, they were able to get pressure on him 70.5% of the time. However, they got 0 sacks out of it. So is that an encouraging thing for Georgia that they were able to get that pressure that often when they blitzed? Would you change up the type of blitz that they were using since they couldn't get the sack, or how would you interpret that, Don?
I'm assuming these stats you're talking about might have again come from Pro Football Focus.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about, you said they got pressure 75% of the time. Is that what I heard?
70.5.
70.5. I'd just like to know who's doing all this evaluation, who's doing all this grading, because I suspect it's somebody that may not know as much about football as you do. And
well, I honestly don't know. So
yeah, that's the problem I have with Pro Football Focus. Where are they finding these people? Are these homeless people they're putting to work, or are these retired NFL coaches? I don't know.
I would love to spend some time ripping Pro Football Focus this evening, Don. I would love it.
Yeah.
Well, I will say I brought it up, so you can go ahead, Corey.
I just think it's ridiculous. I mean, you and I both know it's ridiculous. I mean, first of all, they got it right that Kentucky has one of the better offensive lines in the country. But again, I use anecdotal evidence because it's so ridiculous that they rated Iowa as a top 5 offensive line unit in the country. They had Riley Moss as like the number 1 or 2 national as far as cornerbacks are concerned. And then and the problem is, people respect Pro Football Focus because I think Pro Football Focus has done a lot of good work at the NFL level. I think I think they've got a pretty good reputation, but there's obviously a different crew evaluating the college game, and it just doesn't pass the eye test, Don, and it doesn't pass the test from you as a coach.
Absolutely.
I could argue that Iowa's offensive line might be in the bottom 5 of the Big Ten, let alone saying they're top 5 in the country. That's just absurd. But again, I don't know the formula that Pro Football Focus uses, because if they're using, Pro Football Focus, at least how I've always thought what PFF was you take a look at a player in the NFL and they rate a player's performance. Tristan Wirfs is the highest rated offensive tackle in the NFL for week 6. And that kind of thing kind of perked people's ears up. And that usually, I think, passed the eye test. So I think perhaps there's too much emphasis on individuality, if you will. A guy like Linderbaum kind of skews the meter, but that's not, you can't evaluate a unit of 5 guys based on the performance of one, especially when you're talking about the offensive line, because as you know, Don, one breakdown can completely destroy what everyone else on the line is doing, let alone 3 or 4 breakdowns.
Very true. You've heard me say, Corey, it's not enough to have one good lineman or even 4 good linemen, because even 4 good linemen can only typically account for 4 defenders. And obviously it's that 5th lineman that is not up to par. That's the guy that's going to get you beat, because he's going to lose often enough. It only requires one guy to sack the quarterback. Doesn't need to be a sack party. Doesn't need to be 2 or 3 people back there around his neck. Just one will do.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry to go on a rant about Pro Football Focus drill MVP, but I do get annoyed by that. But no, you could be right. And as far as Bryce Young is concerned, his mobility, and maybe Don, if you want to touch on that, just his ability to escape an effective pass rush, which he's going to get again with Georgia.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that Pro Football Focus said they achieved their goal of pressure, however you define pressure, 70.5% of the time. And my response would be, if you were successful with pressure 70% of the time, then how come you got 0 sacks at the end of the game? In truth, one reason is because the quarterback has good mobility. He's got good escapability. He ran around. He avoids sacks. He still made some plays. He made plays with his feet even. I think he had 40 yards rushing, as I recall, in that game. And obviously they hit some big plays. Now, I heard somebody that I would classify as an expert. I can't remember who it was, but it was a former coach, I think, or somebody I had respect for in college football. Maybe it was just a seasoned broadcaster, but he made this general comment, and who knows if it's accurate, because I haven't even had a chance to see the game from start to finish. Been tied up with analytics to the point I haven't seen the entire game in one sitting. But he made the comment that Georgia now realizes they cannot sit back and play zone and get carved up by an Alabama passing attack that I believe averaged 9.6 per attempt. I think it was 440 something yards maybe. And his point was, I think you're going to see a different plan out of Georgia. It's going to be a plan that involves pressure. And he suggested to me that in general, they didn't try to bring an unusual amount of pressure, that they typically rushed for and played zone and paid a price to do that. So his suggestion was it's going to be a different game plan. This one's going to involve maybe taking some chances in terms of coverage, but doing so to generate sacks and generate turnovers. And I don't doubt for a minute that it's going to involve more pressure than the previous game, because obviously what they did against Alabama 5 weeks ago didn't work very well at all. So it wouldn't shock me at all if Georgia decides to roll the dice and bring more pressure, even though that's not traditionally how they play. They traditionally play a little bit like Iowa does, except they're just doing it with better players in some cases. And that would be really sound, be able to hold up well with your front 7 versus a running game, and be able to play zone and keep your eyes on the quarterback and react to the ball.
That was very in-depth of you, Don. There's a lot of good wisdom in there.
Well, Thank you. I try.
You do a good job, Don, and so do you, Corey. One of the things I would like to ask both of you all, and I know Corey's a fan, would get this probably more, is there a mental aspect to this game from Georgia's side, from them playing Alabama anyway, since they've lost to them with under Kirby Smart 4 straight times, and this is the team that they always lose to? Or do you all think that's just talk?
Well, I think there's enough data there to make the argument that there is something to be said about a mental edge. But I also think it reminds me of the discussions, and Minnesota Dave will remember these discussions we had. Remember heading into the final week of the regular season, you and I, Don, were talking about Iowa's path to the Big Ten West Championship. And it was, of course, by beating Nebraska. But because they played Black Friday, yes, if Iowa won, they'd be putting more pressure on Wisconsin to win. But by Iowa winning, it also took away any chance of Minnesota winning the West. And so that was a factor in that Wisconsin-Minnesota game as well. So there's a lot of different head games going on. So you got to wonder if the mental, the mental aspect is a factor in all this. But you wonder which one of those battles, so to speak, ends up prevailing. There's obviously the Georgia-Bama recent history that's been very one-sided. There's also the revenge factor, if you want to call it that, Don, from the regular season loss. And, I think there's probably just the factor of from Georgia or from Alabama's standpoint, you dominate a team. I don't care if you've got to play them a second time and it's hard to beat it's the same team twice. You dominate a team like they dominated Georgia. That's got to give you a mental edge, one would think.
Yeah, I lost you for a split second there, Corey, but I think I know what you were about to say. And one thing that comes to mind for me, you have to realize, too, how these last 4 games have gone. Of course, Kirby Smart's lost 4 times to Nick Saban already. And at least in a couple of cases, Georgia was up by, I think, a couple of touchdowns or more and still went on to lose the game. So it's not as if, even if they get off to a great start, it doesn't guarantee a win because they've lost those leads in previous games. And you only have to go back 5 weeks ago to realize a lot of people might have forgotten, but that game started off 10-0 Georgia. And then by the time halftime rolled around, Alabama was right back in it. They scored 24 points in the second quarter. They beat them in the second quarter, which is a quarter that Georgia had beaten everyone in, but not Alabama. So the only point I'm trying to make, I guess, even if Georgia gets off to a good start, if Alabama starts pressing from behind, there's going to be that little thought in the back of their head, here we go again. We've been through this before. We could beat them for the first quarter. I just don't know if we can beat them for the next 45 minutes.
Okay. And I want to go to a specific play that Don probably has seen that could change the game. So it's 10-0 at the end of the first quarter. And it shows you how the beautifulness of college football, that one play could literally change an entire game. John Mechie runs a deep post route and catches it and scores a touchdown. And makes it 10-7, and Alabama is immediately back in the game. If that pass, for whatever reason, is incomplete, Georgia gets the ball, and they score a touchdown, it's 17-0. And the game's almost over at that point, as far as I'm concerned. All the momentum's with Georgia. Alabama can't do nothing on offense. They've gone 3 and out like 2 or 3 straight times. So it's when people see the score, it appears lopsided, but it was really just a 10-minute stretch in the second quarter, in my opinion, that made it so lopsided.
Not to nitpick on that, but I was thinking, and I could be wrong because I'm not a Bama fan, I'm not a Georgia fan, I'm not claiming to be, but I was thinking it was the other wide receiver, Jamison Williams, that had the touchdown, the long touchdown when it was 10-0. Am I wrong?
It might have been. I thought it was Mechie, but
Mechie had one too.
It's either way, my point's the same.
Right. Don?
That does bring up a good point. A lot of the listeners may not be aware. If they're Georgia, Alabama fans, they're all aware. But Mechie is not going to be playing tomorrow night. So that is a loss. A player that's been important to them over the course of the season. Of course, even Mechie would tell you, it's not all about me. It's all about our team. And there'll be somebody else to step in and do a good job. Just talking about big plays, I'm sitting here looking at the results of the game. Alabama had 7 explosive plays compared to Georgia's 4. So that's a pretty big edge. These 7 plays, let me do the math right quick, 131, 53, 176, 190, 254 yards in those 7 plays. So that's a lot of chunk yardage. And this is the same Georgia team that doesn't give up big plays. At least they hadn't given up very many over the course of the season. Think about this. I think they were averaging 6.9 points allowed per game until they ran into Alabama and gave up 41. Although I think the score is a little misleading. There's no way it's going to be a 17-point spread again. The thing I'm aware of that you're probably aware of too, Corey, one of those touchdowns was a pick six on the part of an Alabama defense. So that brings up another good point. Turnover margin is not one of those top 5 parameters, incidentally, I'll tell you that. But just for the record, Alabama was +2 on turnovers in that championship game. And if they're +2 again, it'll be that much more difficult for Georgia to win all over again. It's not a good idea to be -2 and try to win a football game, especially against a good opponent.
Darrell MVP, I want to challenge you on one thing because you're the only guy on the line right now. So if you don't mind, I want to keep you here for a second. So I see your comment here in the chat. Let me pull it up for everybody to see. And I'm interested to have this conversation because, again, we're talking about the playoffs specifically in the championship game. But you made the comment, you said the SEC is better at the top and bottom. However, the Big Ten is better in the middle. Now, again, this involves, if we really want to hash it all out, you really have to do a lot of research and look at strength of schedule and again, non-conference schedules. And we're weighing a lot of different things to actually come to a conclusive decision here on which conference is better. But when you say the SEC is better at the top and the bottom, so what teams are we comparing? If that's a fair way of doing a basic evaluation of the bottom of a conference, what teams at the bottom are we comparing? Because I think it's fair to say that the top of the Big Ten, if you're taking the top two teams from each conference, you could say pretty conclusively that it appears as if Georgia and Alabama are better collectively than Ohio State and Michigan. But what teams are we looking at the bottom where you say that the SEC is better than the Big Ten?
Well, in terms of, I'll give you Vanderbilt is the worst team out of both conferences. Okay, I'll just straight up say that. Vanderbilt is the worst. But I think LSU, Auburn, Missouri, I think those three teams could go 3-0 against Northwestern, Nebraska, and Rutgers.
See, that's, I know, and listen, I respect your opinion on that. I think that's a hard, obviously that we're just speculating. Don, go ahead.
Is this the same Missouri team that lost to Army in the bowl game?
Yes, it is the same team that lost to Missouri in the bowl, Army in the bowl game. But Army's not a horrible
that's
team.
Not really an endorsement for Missouri, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the same. You said, did you bring up Auburn, caller?
Yeah, Auburn.
Yeah, I mean, so Auburn, LSU, and again, I know record. If we're just comparing record, that's not going to work in this discussion, and it's not a valid way to actually effectively and accurately hash this out. But again, you've got LSU losing to Kansas State in a bowl game, Auburn losing to Houston, Florida losing to Central Florida, Vanderbilt went 2-10. Again, Missouri went 6-7. South Carolina, they won their bowl game, right? They were 6-6, beat UNC in the bowl game.
Yeah, they beat North Carolina.
You're right. And then, of course, Tennessee losing at 7-5, so they ended up 7-6. Now, again, records aren't the perfect indicator, but if anything, Don, if you're just comparing records, I would give, if we're going to just compare records, I would always give the edge to the Big Ten because of what you brought up earlier. That is the fact that the SEC usually schedules at least 3 cupcakes in the non-conference schedule. And Darrell MVP, you're familiar with this. Kentucky scheduled 3 cupcakes, correct? With Chattanooga.
Oh, yeah, we did. We scheduled 3 cupcakes. But one of the things I hate about, I get it. It's harder to play non-conference games than A-conference games. But listen, the SEC is not getting punished in any way, shape, or form playing A-conference games. If anything, the Big 10, the Big 12, they should also go to 8. We're not getting punished for it. You all need to get with the time.
Well,
I mean, until we get punished for it, I don't think we should change.
Well, I respect that stance, Don. He's got a point. I mean, unless we're going to look at, and that's why Mark always makes a point of the playoff as an invitational. He's absolutely right. As long as we have humans that are just going to sit here and say, well, I think Alabama's the best team, I think Georgia's the best team, they're probably right. But if we're not going to base anything off resume, then what's the point? What are we doing out here? Why are we even playing the games? You might as well Alabama might as well just schedule 8 to 10 cupcakes, Don, and then just play 4 games that they know they're going to win. And the committee's going to look at it and say, well, they had a top 3 recruiting average the past 4 or 5 years. They're probably the best team, and they're always going to get a place in the playoff.
That's why I have a lot of respect for the Big 12 and what they do. All 10 teams play each other. You play 9 conference opponents. That's all there are. Everyone plays everyone. Now you get a true champion.
But Don, you don't like the Big 12, the fact that then they go play the same team again. They always have a rematch.
I wouldn't want them to have to play a week later in the conference championship game, but it may happen that way one of these years. It hadn't yet, but it's just a matter of time before it does.
Yeah, I think it's a fair discussion to have at Darrell MVP. And again, the SEC versus Big Ten talk. I just was not impressed by what I saw from the SEC. And I know the bowl season, you can't read too far into bowl season. Mark has made a point of bringing that up on numerous occasions. But I was just not impressed with anybody anybody at the bottom of the conference in the SEC as far as postseason games. And I hear a lot of SEC people that claim that these games don't matter. They don't care about these games. All they care about are the playoff games, the New Year's Six bowl games. Well, I think that's
arrogance. That's arrogance right there, because they matter to me.
It's an easy thing to say when you're losing all those games.
Right. Well, in fairness to LSU, they only had 39 scholarship players, and they didn't even have a quarterback. I get it. It's their fault they don't have that many players. But if we took 39 players from any team, and those own 39 players could start and have to play the entire game, it's going to be tough for them to win.
Yeah, in the SEC, let's be honest, Florida's rebuilding, LSU is rebuilding with different coaching staffs, but I think it should be a year-by-year conversation. I don't like this whole, well, who cares? The SEC is better over the past 10 years. This is a year-by-year debate, and I just don't think it's clear-cut this year. There have been years in the past few years that I've looked at the SEC versus the Big Ten and said the SEC was clearly the better conference. So I do think it's a year-by-year thing.
Closer this year. I think it's closer this year, but I think the SEC this year's the better conference, and I think it is funny to laugh at these teams that lose to bowl season. Like Florida lost to UCF. That's going to be hilarious to talk about off season. And so I agree with you there, but some of these teams I would like to talk about in the bottom of the Big Ten. Okay. You had Northwestern. They lost to Duke.
Yeah, it's not a good football team. You're right.
Yeah, but if you're comparing the bottom of the SEC, they got to play the bottom of the Big Ten.
Well, let's look at the bottom of the Big Ten. All right, let me pull up the bottom of the Big Ten so we can actually have a discussion, because I just brought up 6 teams from the SEC that I don't, again, when you're talking about penciling in 3 wins. So bottom of the Big Ten. So Indiana would be the equivalent of Vanderbilt as far as record. Now 2-10, but again, my understanding is didn't Indiana play Cincinnati in the non-conference? So they played Cincinnati in the non-conference. So one of their only 3 non-conference games were against a playoff team. So 2-10, but they were 2-10. Of course, Rutgers was 5-7, had to play Wake Forest, ACC runner-up, had to play them in a bowl game. Maryland was 7-6. Of course, destroyed their bowl opponent. I don't remember who it was. Virginia Tech. Again, not impressive. Virginia Tech, I think, basically stinks. Nebraska's 3-9. Northwestern's 3-9, but is it fair to say that we could basically say that both those teams are 4-8 if you're playing an SEC schedule, Don, or is that not an SEC non-conference schedule?
Yeah, they can simply schedule
weighing the conferences. Yeah, if we're giving the conferences the same weight as far as strength of schedule.
Right. Let's not forget that Iowa plays Iowa State every year too. That's another example of a quality non-conference opponent.
I don't think there's any Big Ten team that doesn't play that plays 3 cupcakes like the SEC. So I don't think there's any Big Ten team that does that, correct? And then, of course, the 4th game is a conference game. If we're going to equate those four games that the SEC plays at a conference,
I think most people. I know what coach.
We can't do out of conference because the SEC would lose 100% of the time. But as I said earlier, you can be upset by it, or you could be upset at the NCAA for. So, if they said, hey, you got to play non-conference games to make the playoffs, SEC would be like, okay, we're going to make non-conference games to be in the playoffs.
Yeah, and so here it comes into we're getting into the debate of the college football playoff and ESPN and who works for who and whose agenda is whose agenda. So yeah, I get it. You're right. I mean, the SEC has taken advantage. Nick Saban has been ruling the roost on this for how many years now, Don? And I know you have a lot of respect for Nick Saban, but he's the most powerful coach in the entire country. And it shows as far as and the SEC is the most powerful conference. I think we can say that, correct?
I think it's the best league. I give it an edge against any other conference.
I think it's close. I don't know that I don't think I've ever conclusively said that the Big Ten is better. I think it's closer than people think. And again, I don't have a problem. I mean, certainly the discussion at the bottom is an interesting one. Real MVP. I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think it's an interesting discussion to have because I'm just not impressed by either league at the bottom.
Against Houston. Houston is a top 20 team in the country. They would play Nebraska or Rutgers. I think Army would probably, I mean, not Army. I think Auburn would probably win that game.
Yeah, you could be right. And again, we're just tossing ideas out there at this point because it's all speculation, right? I mean, of who would win what game, and bowl season's evidence of that. Anybody can beat anybody on any given day when you're stacking up opponents that are fairly close.
Just for the record, Corey, as I recall, the Big Ten was 6-4 this bowl season. What was the SEC record?
The losing record.
We were
right?
5-7.
5-7.
But it's kind of misleading because the SEC East was 500 and the SEC West was under 500. So if you went strictly by bowl records, you would say the SEC East is better than the SEC West. And I don't think anybody believes that's true.
No, and that's why you can't just go off bowl records. So, you end up talking in circles because it's not a fair conversation to just compare that way. So there's a lot that goes into it. And that's why there should never be, like, it's easy to say the Big Ten's better than the Pac-12. It's easy to say that the SEC is better than the ACC. I don't think there's a discussion, but when you're splitting hairs like this, there's a lot of different analytics and stats that you could break down and numbers. And it takes a lot more work than what we're giving it right now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right, sir.
I agree with that. But it was great talking to you, Corey and Don. I hope you're able to do this show in the off season and next year. Appreciate
it, sir. Have a great night and look forward to the game tomorrow.
Yep, looking forward to it.
And again, I have no problem with someone arguing that the SEC is better, Don. I would simply say that I don't think it's as clear-cut as some people make it out to be. That's how people are with everything now. It's not just sports. Everything's black or white. There's nothing in between. There's nothing's up for debate or discussion. It's just cut and dry. So and he's being respectful about it. I'm not saying that about the real MVP, but I don't think it's as clear cut as people like Paul Feinbaum make it out to be.
Right.
All right, we do have another call here for you, Don. Thank you for calling the Voice of College Football. Who's on the line?
Hello, Mansky from Tumwa, Wisconsin, Corey. Good evening, Don and Corey.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. I've got a coaching question for you both to dive into. I find it interesting, coaching personalities, and I know Hayden Fry was a Marine, and when I went to school there was a party, and I can't remember when it was during the day, but I think every player that I had contact with to any degree was impressive. Hap Patterson, George Davis. I'm missing a really good guy, but Chuck Long once, I knew his best friend from Wheaton, Illinois, and it was a party, and Chuck came about 10:30 and to see his best friend from Wheaton, and it was a small gathering and had a few beverages, and about 10 to 12, Chuck started saying his goodbyes, and he worked the room. He was very professional, and so when he got going past me, I said, it's 10 to 12. Where are you going next? He says, I got to head home. I said, you must have a big day tomorrow. And he says, no, Hayden might call me. And I said, really? And he said, you wouldn't enjoy the first call when he caught you breaking curfew. And so that's why you never had it happen a second time. And I think, Don, I think your coaching staff really instilled discipline. And Hayden was a former Marine. And I think probably he didn't hire anybody who didn't have discipline. But I'd like you both to comment on Kirby Smart and Nick Saban, your opinions of those coaches, what you know about them, what you think of them. It's this conflict between head coaches. It's really between the players. But the media sure is making this a big head coach versus head coach. And I'd rather watch the game. But I sure want you to dive into that because I don't know as much as maybe I should be. I remember when Nick Saban was at Michigan State and he was awful impressive, and I was kind of sad when he left the Big Ten. But go ahead and dive into that, gentlemen.
Don, you want to offer your thoughts?
Sure, be happy to. I've known Nick Saban ever since he was an assistant at Michigan State years ago. Matter of fact, you recall, Corey, that when I was at Western Illinois, we played LSU. They won the national title that year. And prior to the game, I mentioned to Nick, I said, I want to congratulate you on the job your defense did back in 1985. That was the year, you might recall, Corey, where we beat them 35-31. We were number one ranked, and it was all we could do to beat them in Kinnick. And I said, just so you know, Nick, that's the best disguise coverage I'd ever seen out of a secondary. That was your secondary, the one you coached. And I just wanted to congratulate you all over again about how well they disguised coverage. And his response was, well, it didn't do us a hell of a lot of good. You still put 35 points on us. And last time I checked, didn't have any difficulty throwing and catching the ball either. And I think we were ahead of our time as far as reading coverage. And, we have optional routes, different routes versus different coverages, so that the quarterback and the receivers are all on the same page. But that still does not give proper credit to Michigan State for the job they did in disguising coverage. We could handle it okay, but a lot of teams in the Big Ten could not. Anyway, the reason I bring it up, he was a great coach even back in 1985 as an assistant. And I certainly have great respect for Nick because I know he's got a great work ethic. I've always said, never, ever have to admit that you don't work as hard as your assistants. And I'm confident that Nick Saban puts in the same long hours of everybody else on that staff. And if you set the right example as a head coach, then it's not hard for people to follow. And I think he certainly sets a great example. I don't know Kirby as well as I know Nick, certainly, but I've got a lot of respect for Kirby Smart too. And I'll just say it this way. A lot of young coaches have asked me, give me some good advice for how to be the best possible head coach. And one of the things I've always told them is you have to have two things in your favor to be successful as a head coach. You have to be liked and respected. And 1 out of 2 is not enough. Liked and respected. There are coaches that are liked but not respected. There are coaches that are respected but not liked. You got to have both on your side. If you do have both, then at that point, those players will do anything they can to help you to achieve the team goals that we've set out for ourselves to achieve. And Marv Cook is an example I like to think back on because it meant a lot to me when Marv mentioned this. I was bragging on Marv for how well he maximized his abilities to play tight end in the Big Ten. And he said, Coach, here's one thing you never realized. One reason that I played so well is because I never, ever wanted to disappoint you as my position coach. And I never really thought about that until he said it. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. One reason those guys performed so well for Hayden Fry is because they liked and respected him. Truthfully, they didn't like him, they loved him. And if a coach has the right relationship with his players, then there's love in both directions. Marv is like the son I never had. And I think a lot of coaches, if you have the right relationship with your players, I'm talking about assistant coaches, it really is almost a father-son relationship or an uncle-nephew relationship, if you will. And I think when you have that working for you, that's when you get great results. I know those players like and respect Nick, and I know one reason they respect him for his football knowledge, obviously. But I also do know this. Some of those players have really good impersonations of Nick Saban because I've heard them. And again, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Those players would not imitate their head coach if they didn't like and respect him. I believe that with all my heart. That's one reason year in and year out, Alabama plays so well.
I got nothing to match what Coach just went through. So here's what I'll say about, you mentioned the media trying to make this a battle of the coaches. That's just what the media does, right? I mean, this is not a game. I could be totally off on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of maybe the worst rated, as far as TV ratings are concerned, the worst rated national title games since the playoff format began. Would you agree with that, Don?
Yeah, you'll have a great TV audience from the SEC country, of course, but a lot of other parts of the country won't really care so much because they don't have a dog in the fight.
Hope that answers your question, Lemansky.
Would you care to comment or give a score on the game? Would you have a crystal ball or what you think it's going to end up being?
Well, that's what Kenneth asked here. Is Coach making a pick tonight? Don, you never make picks with the Iowa games. Can you make a pick here? We've got two teams that aren't really – you don't have a horse in this race, Don.
It's compelling. I've heard all those same – it is true. It's not easy to beat someone twice. And yet you've got this other factor that you've got Georgia, who somehow seems to have difficulty in solving a game against Alabama. Here's another factor in there. Record against former assistant coaches is now 25-1. Now, the one did happen this year, you might recall, Corey. That was Texas A&M. So that record has been broken. But Kirby Smart's not the only former assistant that has a hard time beating Coach Saban. There are any number of former assistants that have never beaten him. And I'm not sure that Kirby's going to be able to do it tomorrow night either. I do like their chances. I think Georgia's got a wonderful team. But I still, if it's down to a championship game, it's hard for me to bet against Nick Saban because history says he'll find a way to win it. On paper, Georgia looks better. And yet, on paper, they looked better 5 weeks ago, too. And that didn't get them too far in that particular game. And I guess if you put a gun to my head, I'd swallow really hard and still pick Alabama. And having said that, it won't surprise me if Georgia beats them because I think they're very capable. They got to get over that mental hurdle of being able to find a way to beat Alabama. It's been a struggle. They haven't won a championship since 1980, as I recall, 42 years.
I'm just flabbergasted that Bryce Young threw for 455 yards or whatever it was against that defense. I mean, I know that's just simplifying it, but good Lord. No picks, 3 touchdowns. And I know he had a ton of attempts, but I mean, it wasn't an air raid from either team, but I mean, man, these are two teams that know how to. I know people diss Stetson Bennett, but I thought he made some nice plays in that game. I thought he looked good against Michigan, to be completely honest, against a really good Michigan defense, Don. So it should be a fun game to watch. There's no question about it. I mean, again, I think ratings-wise, you bring up a good point. The SEC is going to be fully invested in this, and certainly college football rules down in the South. But I think it's going to be a fun game to watch. I would be surprised if it's not a lot closer than the SEC title game, just from a score perspective.
I think it'll be a one-score game.
Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question. I do think it's going to be close, and I'll be watching. I mean, I'm disappointed that it's. I don't think it's good for college football that you have 2 SEC teams. I don't think it'd be good for college football if it was 2 Big Ten teams. Okay, so I'm not just trying to sound like a homer. I don't think it's good for the sport. But with that being said, I would have to think it's going to be a lot closer.
I think you guys got good chemistry. I want you to know that after the first time I saw your program, I emailed Mark Rogers, and I complimented you both on your program. So I want to pass that along because sometimes you get into interesting conversations like the last caller, and I think you do a fantastic job with all the callers. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
You have a great night, and I always appreciate hearing that. I give you the credit, Don. You're the man. You come ready to go. So, and I do see a lot of Tide fans in here. Maybe there's more Georgia fans than I'm seeing here in the chat. And let me see here. There are a couple of questions that Yakov22 has asked for you, Don. Did Coach watch the high school All-American game yesterday? Did you get a chance to watch it? And I gave some thoughts last night on my show about Aaron Graves and Xavier Wampa, and we've talked about Aaron Graves. Of course, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about him because he's, of course, an Iowa kid who will be coming in next year, but he looked really good against really good competition. We've talked about how difficult it is to evaluate somebody who's playing against the Class 2A level. I thought Aaron Graves looked really good. Let's get to our next caller. Thank you for calling the Voice of College Football. Who's on the line?
Hi, this is Dave Greenfield. A regular. I call into Mark Rogers' show quite a bit, and I've gotten a chance to call in and speak to you before. I'm an Ohio State fan, and wanted to talk a little bit about this championship game. And I just posted something in the chat, and get your thoughts on it. When watching Alabama over the years, I had a conversation with Mark Rogers about this. I said, how many times since 2009 do you think Nick Saban has been on the field with a team that has had a better, more talented roster than his? And I don't know what your guys' thoughts are. We could only think of about 5 teams, maybe since 2009. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
It's a great question, Don. You have any thoughts?
I just don't feel I've seen enough of the SEC games through the years to make a comment. I do think it's safe to say that his personnel in general is better than the opponent. And having said that, even in those unlikely scenarios where it's not better than the opponent, I might still give Nick Saban the edge on coaching, and that may not be enough to overcome. You could argue that Georgia has better personnel than Alabama. Not that it happens that way year in and year out, but this particular year, you could argue that Georgia, in terms of pure personnel, actually has an edge. I can't even argue against that because I do know they have a lot of 4 and 5 star players, maybe even more than Alabama does. But I still just realize and put value on the fact that Saban has the best reputation among any head coaches out there. And on top of that, Alabama's program has earned the respect as a team for how well they can perform in big games. It's difficult to bet against Alabama in the biggest of all games. All those national titles speak for themselves. So it'll be a real credit to Georgia if they can break that string. I think they're certainly capable of doing it. But there are a few mental hurdles they have to get over in the process because, as we mentioned already, just starting off well against Alabama doesn't guarantee anything. It's difficult to do it for 4 full quarters. That's what you have to do. And I know Georgia's preparing to get that done, and they certainly might be good enough to do it. That's why it's going to be so interesting to see how that entire game plays out, because I seriously expect it'll be decided in the last few minutes of the game.
And let me just make something clear. I mean, Texas A&M, Alabama is a perfect example of. Now I know A&M has recruited really well, and they recruited really well again this year. But I mean, nobody's going to try to convince you that A&M has a better overall roster as far as talent rankings than in Alabama. But A&M won that game with a backup quarterback, so I wouldn't assume that even if you want to weigh the metrics and say that Alabama's got clearly the more talented roster. That doesn't necessarily mean, especially if we're talking about a rematch, doesn't necessarily mean that Alabama's going to win this game tomorrow.
No, I would tend to agree. I actually posted in the chat. I think overall, I actually do think Georgia has a more talented roster. By the way, some of the other rosters we thought of, one of the rosters that came up was 2011 LSU. That you remember that year that LSU beat them during the regular season game, and then of course lost the rematch in the Superdome.
Right.
But I would put this Georgia roster up there. I mean, to me, it's kind of interesting because usually the teams that have beaten Alabama in the past, going back to like the Clemson years with the Deshaun Watson teams, where they lost a close game. Alabama beat them in a close game the one year. And then Clemson, of course, won a close game the next year. But if you go look at that game, I would say that Alabama clearly had the better roster. But where was Clemson better than Alabama at the most important position, which was quarterback? And that's kind of the way I feel about this game. I just posted in the chat that I think Georgia has the better overall roster, but Alabama is better at the most important position on the field. And what your guys' thoughts are on that?
Well, it's yeah, you're right. Starts with quarterback, right? And we haven't really talked a whole lot about the Bennett versus Young matchup, but that is a game changer, Don.
I have a lot of respect for Stetson Bennett. He played very well this season, but Bryce Young is pretty amazing. A freshman winning the Heisman Trophy and playing in all kinds of big games and playing really well in his first of many SEC championship games. It's impressive that he was able to do that. You've heard him interviewed a time or two, Corey. He's got amazing poise for a young quarterback. And you've also heard me say, I used to say this about Chuck Long and Matt Rogers, to name 2 quarterbacks. I can say it about Chuck Hartley also. If the game's down to one play, his pulse rate's going to go up about that much. It appears that Bryce Young's like that. He's just a really cool operator. It's hard to imagine he's going to get flustered in this game tomorrow night. And I don't know that Bennett will get flustered either. But if you had to assign odds to who's more likely to be flustered, I'd probably go with Bennett, simply because Bryce Young appears to be off the charts in terms of being cool, calm, and collected.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It'd be interesting to see if Bennett could duplicate. I was surprised he played that well against Michigan in the semifinal. I did think Georgia was going to win that game. I just thought it'd be a little bit more competitive of the game because I didn't think that that Bennett would play that well. I didn't think they would score that many points against Michigan's defense. I thought Michigan's defense would have kept the game a little bit closer. I did not think that Michigan could run the ball against that front seven because they had not seen a front seven like that in the Big Ten. I say that as an Ohio State fan, of course. They ran the ball down our throat. But, I mean, that was why I liked Georgia in that game. But I did not see Bennett playing that well going into that game, especially against Michigan's defense and coming off the heels of that bad performance in the SEC title game.
I think, if I may interject here for a second, I think the one thing I would offer into this conversation, Don, is let's not underestimate and Iowa fans recognize this, let's not underestimate the power of having a well-called game from your coaching staff, specifically your offensive coaching staff. I thought it was a really well-called game from Georgia's standpoint against, again, a Michigan defense that had not faced, a Michigan defense that necessarily hadn't faced exactly what Georgia offers. But Georgia's not lighting the world on fire offensively, hasn't been. I mean, carried by that front line, defensive line, and that front seven for most of the season. And I was just impressed with the game that was called by Kirby Smart and that offensive staff.
Yeah, I do wonder how many people even know who the play caller is for Alabama. I think a lot of people don't even know.
It's Monken Todd Monken is the offensive coordinator for Georgia, and Bill O'Brien, the former Penn State Houston coach, is the offensive coordinator for Alabama.
And he's been
That's what I was going to mention. The OC for Alabama is a guy that had a great reputation as a head coach. So,
he
didn't have a bunch of average Joes coaching for him. He's got a special group of coaches, I think. I might give a slight edge to Alabama in terms of assistants. And I'm not saying at all that Georgia doesn't have great assistant coaches too. But how many people have an assistant coach that's got NFL credentials? It's pretty unusual.
Yeah, that's the one thing Nick Saban can do is he can always dip back into the NFL and find assistant coaches. I would say that Houston Texans fans might beg to differ if Bill O'Brien was maybe the best coach in the world, but
he did a heck of a job at Penn State picking up the pieces there.
Yes, he did.
They did. Hey, a bottom line before I let you guys go, just what are your thoughts on point total? I said to Mark Rogers, I think Georgia could win this game in the high 20s. I mean, the last few times it's been like 23, 24 points they've scored against Alabama. What type of point total do you think it's going to take for them to win this?
I'd say higher than that. I see this game in the 30s, Don.
Yeah, I think the recent games that they have played have been pretty high scoring, right? I think the over-under, I don't know what it is, but I read somewhere that somebody was confident you should bet the over. I think, historically it's been a game maybe involving 60-something points, I think. I wouldn't feel very safe being in the 20s. I think it might take the 30s to be able to generate a win.
Okay. Yeah, I could see maybe 28-27 tops. I think Georgia's defense is going to play a little bit better this time than they did last time. Maybe not give up those deep bomb passes that they gave up in the Georgia Dome like they did last time. So, but I just hope for a good game. As a fan, neither fan of either team. A good friend of mine is a Georgia fan, so I'll probably be pulling for the Dogs. But
I have to admit, I'll be pulling for the Dogs as well. I'm right there with you.
I think it would be healthy for college football if Georgia won.
Yeah,
because it's been 42 years, I believe, since they've won, and let's face it, it's incredible what Alabama's been able to accomplish. But other people out there need to have hope that they can also find a way to the promised land. And let's face it, Georgia's players have sacrificed just like Alabama's players have, and it'd be nice if they had something special to show for it.
Okay. Couple things I want to catch up to here, and we'll just spend a moment on this. So I addressed this yesterday, but the comment here, Iowa needs a black transfer quarterback. I said it yesterday, I'll say it again. Doesn't matter what the skin color is of the quarterback. I think the argument can be made that Iowa needs a mobile quarterback. Iowa has, contrary to this narrative that this individual is trying to push on our show here, he's trying to push it last night, Iowa has recruited mobile quarterbacks. Brad Banks is a perfect example. Marvin McNutt is another one, Don. But specifically the mobile aspect, because again, I see this individual asking you this question, directing it towards you. let me find it here. He does want to know about your thoughts on getting a black transfer quarterback. But again, I just don't think that's appropriate. We're talking about race playing a factor in recruiting. I don't think Iowa looks at that. They're looking at the best available, as they should. I do think Iowa needs to go after a mobile quarterback, whether he be black, white. So what are your thoughts on quarterback, if you will?
Absolutely. It doesn't matter whether he's black, white, or green. He just needs to be mobile.
So you do agree that's a big need for Iowa to upgrade and get somebody who can move in the pocket better?
Well, let's not forget, we have no guarantees at all that Padilla is going to stay. We've discussed this, Corey, and I'm sure you feel this way even now. If he left, we certainly couldn't begrudge him for doing it. So imagine the predicament we're going to be in if he takes off. Now, I guess the good news, if he's going to transfer now, he's got to do it in a hurry, because school's going to start up here in the middle of the month, I think, and you can late enroll, of course, up to a point. But I think
Don, he could transfer after spring. He could transfer after spring if he chose to.
Correct. Yeah, that's another hurdle that we have to get over as far as keeping them both. I know that those guys are good friends, but let's face it, Padilla would like to play. And in the old days, guys never even thought much about transferring. Of course, back then you had to sit out a year, so it was something you had to really agonize over before you left. It's too bad that we don't have that same rule in effect now, because it would eliminate a lot of the transfers. And part of the educational process is not running from your problems, but confronting them. So if you're the backup, then find a way to play better. And if you're not the starter, then be sure you can say with certainty that you motivated that starting quarterback to work even harder and better to keep his job. Otherwise, you were prepared to take it from him. So, I can think of all kinds of examples where young men persisted. Maybe they didn't start for 4 years, and then they ended up all conference as a fifth-year player and ended up playing in the NFL, even though only started 1 year. Mark Vlasic's a good example of that, a name you're very familiar with, Corey. He played behind Chuck Long. And I remember vividly a Big Ten coach saying, well, we couldn't beat you guys this year with Long, but now Long's gone. And I said, well, here's the bad news. We have a guy that can throw better than Chuck Long that's coming back. And I'd be willing to bet that Mark might have had more passing yards in the NFL than Chuck did. But he was certainly an outstanding quarterback, and he didn't run away from his problems. He simply kept the heat on Chuck to be as good as Chuck could be. Chuck was a runner-up for the Heisman. If he was anything less than that, he probably wouldn't have been able to job.
Question from Vandy Dandy. Corey Beretta, do you have an OnlyFans? I do not. I only recently found out what OnlyFans is for content creators. I do not. I have Twitter. I don't even have a Patreon page yet. So, but if you want to follow me on YouTube and Twitter from the Hawkeye of the Storm. But I do appreciate that question, and that's been something I've contemplated. The man here asks you a question, Don. Does the term dual threat okay, now I'm trying to piece what he's trying to say here. Coach, does the term dual threat often mean to you that the QB is a good athlete but doesn't know or yet know how to read a defense and where to go with the football? If that question makes sense, Don.
Well, I think there are dual threat quarterbacks out there that have great minds also, that do have a great idea where to go with the ball. So if you just want to talk about specifics, I want to recruit a quarterback that does have above average mobility, that also has above average intelligence, and they're out there. And maybe they're only 6'1", but that's okay, because as Coach Fry used to say, there's no perfect players out there. There's something wrong with all of them. So be sure that whatever their shortcoming is, be sure that it's not a deal breaker. A prime example is quarterback. Drew Brees wasn't very tall, but the last time I checked, he had a pretty good NFL career. And I believe there's a little guy playing for the Arizona Cardinals right now that nobody wanted. At least they were skeptical that he would be able to do what he's been able to do in the NFL. So I think you can find a guy that's mobile that also has a great mind. They're out there.
Dependent fanatic. What happened to Indiana?
Good question. A major injury for the quarterback. I think even though he came back and started against us in game 1, I don't think he ever had confidence in his ability to play after that knee injury. He didn't seem like the same confident player that he was in the previous year. And beyond that, I'm not sure. They got off to a horrible start against us. A couple of pick sixes, of course, will make a difference in any game. And they simply couldn't ever recover. And football's a funny thing. When you have momentum going either in a positive or a negative sense, it's sometimes hard to turn it back around.
Cole says Nebraska is way better than their record shows. So we're talking about Big Ten, SEC, this debate back and forth. And again, I know we're focusing on the game, but we kind of went all over the place with this. How do you really, and now I think Cole probably has a point here, but how do you really rate a team like Nebraska that played everybody close but couldn't really beat anybody at 3-9? How do you really say that they're better than they are when they're not actually winning games?
Corey, you've heard me say it this way. Good teams win close games. And if you lose close games, you're a bad team. So even though Nebraska is very, very competitive in so many games, you have to get over the hump. You have to find a way to win close games. Some teams can do it. Those are good teams. Iowa's a prime example. Won all kinds of close games. Nebraska's a team that's found a way to lose. And it's difficult to assign blame, I guess, or maybe it's not. It wants to blame the head coach, but of course, he doesn't deserve all the blame. He deserves a lot of the blame, of course, because the buck stops with him. But truthfully, you got to find a way to win close games. And if you have a history of losing close games, it's going to be difficult to change it. Nebraska's proven that year after year.
To be completely honest, Don, I have no problem with Cole making this statement that he believes Nebraska is better than they are. To me, they're one of the more dangerous teams in the country. Like they're probably the last 3-9 team that I'd want to play, and it's probably not even close.
Absolutely, we've said that. I mean, I said 2 months ago, Nebraska scares me because they're capable of beating a lot of teams, and they proved that this year. They were so close to winning a lot of good games.
All right, Drew asks a question. He says, I have a question for you. My question is, if you stack up the bottom East teams in the SEC versus the bottom West teams in the Big Ten, you'll find that those West teams would win. That's an interesting discussion. Again, we're kind of guessing. We're playing the guessing game as to who would win what matchups. But again, stack up those bottom West teams. We're talking Illinois, we're talking Northwestern, and Nebraska. Those would be your three bottom feeders in the West. And who would be your bottom feeders in the East? In the SEC, Don. Let me pull this up so that I don't misspeak.
I'm not that familiar with their East and West because it's not based on geography. I do remember that.
Yeah, Vanderbilt obviously at 2-10, and then I guess Florida, and then either Mizzou or South Carolina. Probably Mizzou based on bowl performance. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't say definitively either way. Sounds like Drew is convinced the Big Ten would win win that battle, but I would like to think that all those games would be close, and I wouldn't want if I'm any one of those three teams in the East. I agree with our commenter earlier. I would not want to play Nebraska. That'd be the one team I would not want to play, and frankly, I wouldn't want to play Illinois because we saw Illinois go into Happy Valley and win this year, and to me, Illinois is on an upward trajectory right now, and I expect them to maybe not compete for a title next year, but I expect them to be a bowl team next year with Brett Bielema.
I think you have to give Brett a lot of credit in year one. The mark of a good coach is he figures out what weapons he has, and then he puts them to good use. And I think you got to give Illinois credit for that. They played a brand of muscle football, and you could argue that it's kind of second nature to Brett because it kind of did remind you a little bit of old Wisconsin teams. But the bottom line is he went in there and he won those players over. The guys he was playing with, he didn't just recruit them. He inherited those guys. And one of the things I've always talked about is you got to win over the players that are already in the program because you're going to live or die with those guys. It's not going to you don't have time to wait for those guys you recruited. You got to win over the guys that the last coach recruited.
And Jim brings up a valid point as far as looking at bowl season, strictly at bowls. That's why you can't do it because there are other factors. Opt-outs are a factor. Injuries are a factor. When you're just looking at one game and trying to draw these grandiose conclusions based on one game or a set of individual games, if you will, from select teams. Okay, do have another question here if I can find it. Yeah, so this is the comment I wanted to get to. This is obviously an SEC guy. So he says Vandy is better than Rutgers, Missouri is better than Illinois, Kentucky over Purdue, Mississippi State, Northwestern, Arkansas over Minnesota, Ole Miss over Iowa, South Carolina over Indiana, Tennessee over Michigan State. That's funny. Auburn over Maryland, A&M over Nebraska, Florida over Wisconsin, also funny. LSU over Penn State, funny. Georgia over Michigan, obviously, and then Alabama over Ohio State. So it's obviously an SEC guy, Don, but care to offer any thoughts on this breakdown?
I think the whole discussion is kind of ludicrous, really. We're never going to, here's a simple solution. Do you think Missouri's excited about playing Iowa in a non-conference game? I promise you they're not. Makes complete sense, right? It's an adjacent state. You're never going to talk Missouri into that. And I don't think I would be crazy about it either because we're already playing Iowa State. But Missouri wants no part of that, I can promise you.
Well, they had a chance at it last year, Don, and that game didn't happen. So
good point.
Okay. So I do want to bring up a point here. And where did that comment from our good friend, the real Hayden, go? I saw his comment earlier. Let me find it here because I figured we'd give this a moment to bring out as well. Appreciate all the comments, by the way. Our line is open. We're here for a few minutes longer. Maybe I can find it. Don, what'd you have to eat tonight for supper?
Pizza.
Oh, here it is. Bob Saget has passed away, Don.
He was not that old. How old was he?
I believe he was 65.
Okay.
I did see that just as we were jumping on the air. So
he was a young 65, I think.
I don't know what the read was. He sick? Do you know, Don?
Not that I was aware of.
So that's disappointing news. Bob Saget passed away today at, I believe, age 65. So certainly disappointing, and certainly thoughts and prayers to him and his family. Okay. Let's kind of talk a little bit before we finish up here, Don, specifically about Bryce Young. We've seen that Heisman, not that the fact that he won the Heisman has anything directly to do with performance, but we certainly saw Joe Burrow play pretty well after winning a Heisman Trophy a couple of years ago. How does Georgia slow down Bryce Young? Because they weren't able to do it last time out. I think we'd agree with that. He ran for 40 yards, threw for over 450 yards. I mean, against this vaunted Georgia defense, what does Kirby Smart, what does this team do differently to try to slow him down tomorrow?
They got to somehow find a way to get him a little confused or a little flustered. I don't know. I haven't studied the SEC championship game, but you got to find a way to attack him from different directions. My guess, based on what I've heard at least, is that they might logically think about trying to find creative ways to bring more pressure and to be able to register some sacks. Incidentally, I believe it was +3. Alabama was +3 on sacks in that game. So Alabama was able to get to the Georgia quarterback, and yet Georgia never got home in rushing against Alabama. Find a way to turn the ball over. Obviously, it's hard to win football games if you're minus on turnovers. They were -2 last time. I will say this: I couldn't help but notice the only game in the regular season that Alabama lost in terms of turnovers happened to be against A&M. A&M beat them on turnovers. So even though that stat does not have the high winning percentage associated with some of these other parameters, let's face it, anytime you can win on turnovers, that's a good thing. And this year Georgia was able to overcome that. They lost any number of games on turnovers, and yet they won the game. Pretty impressive what they did. Let me just give you an idea. Turnover margin. Georgia, the team that won on turnovers, only won 5 out of 9 games. 4 times the team that won the game lost on turnovers. I believe that team in all cases it was Georgia every time. Let me just verify that. Yeah. Clemson beat them on turnovers and lost the game. South Carolina beat them on turnovers and lost the game. Missouri and Charleston Southern, which was another one of those convenient gimmies that those teams tend to play. Long about game 11, incidentally, the entire conference, if you go back and look, they always schedule that last non-conference game, typically in game 11, to give yourself a breather before that big showdown in game 12. Showdown against your natural rival, of course.
We do have a call here for you, Don. Thank you for calling the Voice of College Football. Who's on the line?
Hi, a couple points. First, in regards to the national championship game coming up, I want to say that Georgia will not be winning this time, and it basically comes down to one factor. Georgia has a white quarterback. And
all right, we're not doing this again, sir. Sorry. Have a good night. I'm not going to deal with it tonight. So you trolled last night. We answered your question. Appreciate the donation, but we're not going to deal with it tonight. It doesn't make anybody here in the chat happy. We've answered your question very professionally, so we're going to move on. Okay, let's. There's a couple questions that I skipped over here, Don. One being from the man here. He says, Coach Don, do you like the concept of an air raid offense throwing the ball 50-plus times a game?
No. And I'll tell you why. Now, if you have an indoor stadium, I guess there's some argument for doing it. But weather's too much of a factor. I don't care where you're playing. The odds of getting through the month of November with good weather aren't very good. So even if you do have an air raid offense, invariably it's going to run into bad weather somewhere along the way. And of course, typically those games in November have a lot riding on them. So I think it's difficult to win if you throw the ball 50 times a game. Here's something that gets overlooked. If you're recruiting all the time for an air raid offense, what do you do when you're playing against an opponent that has a really good hard-nosed rushing attack? You don't even have a good scout team because you've recruited players that don't do that. So that's another problem you run into. If you're recruiting a bunch of players to play in an air raid offense, at some point you can't imitate an opponent that has a muscle attack to it, a muscle offense to its attack. You know, you don't have players to give the defense a good look at what they're going to see on Saturday.
You'll like this, Don. So, where is it here? Seek Truth says, best conference in America, Missouri Valley Conference. You'll like hearing that, Don, the winningest coach in Western Illinois history. Let's talk about the MVC.
Yeah, well, just be fortunate if you don't have North Dakota State on your schedule next year if you're an FBS team, because the odds are they're going to beat you. Iowa found that out themselves. You know, North Dakota State comes to Iowa and beats Iowa. They go to Iowa State and beat Iowa State. They go to Kansas State and beat Kansas State. They've done all of that in recent years. Nobody's crazy enough to schedule North Dakota State right now.
Don, do you remember the 1982 NFC Championship game, Montana to Dwight Clark and the catch 40 years ago tomorrow?
I did not realize that, but I do remember that very well, yes.
And boy, Yakov 22, he's coming locked and loaded tonight with awesome questions. Here's another one that I skipped over earlier and I didn't mean to. Coach Patterson, do you recall playing against is it Joe Theismann? How do you pronounce the last name?
Theismann rhymes with Heisman.
Okay. This is before my time, Don. I'm sorry.
I know the game he's talking about is in Yankee Stadium, and yes, I do remember Joe Theismann playing, and I don't recall the final score, but I do remember it was a routine win for Notre Dame.
All right, we're kind of doing some quick-hitting questions here, Don. Do you see a talent gap between Michigan and Georgia? I saw a bunch of Georgia players that seemed bigger, stronger, and faster than their opponents.
Maybe a slight edge, but nothing really major. I think the thing that gets lost, it's really not entirely about physical matchups. Part of it is still between the years. You know, if a team gets off to a good start, they play with great confidence. And if a team gets off to a poor start, then they wonder what's gone wrong and that they're simply not functioning at a high level. And the next thing you know, the score gets out of hand, and that's what happens sometimes. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to explain scores. It's a crazy business to start comparing scores because invariably there are going to be some scores that are hard to explain. So I think it gets down to play calling again. I mentioned that Detroit line game against the Packers today. I was so happy to see Detroit coming out and just throwing caution to the wind. And next thing you know, the Packers are trying to figure out how to win the game. Now, of course, in the second half, they're playing with a bunch of backups because they're already set for the playoffs. But it was still good to see. You know, Detroit was playing with great passion and great imagination. And it's one reason they were in the game right to the end and found a way to win it.
Kevin wants to know if there's any chance that Iowa can bring in the North Dakota State head coach. Who is the head coach at North Dakota State?
You know, I don't know much about him. I believe he was elevated off the staff, I think. I think he was an assistant coach that simply got moved up. He's been there for 3 years now. He's won 2 national championships. But the North Dakota State fans would say, well, so what? I mean, he's doing the same good job that we expect him to do. Correct me if I'm wrong, they've won 8 or 9 titles now.
Something ridiculous.
I believe they're 9-0 in national championship games.
Am I correct in saying Bowl was the coach? Is it Craig Bowl that's at Wyoming now? So You're saying that the head coach at North Dakota State now was on that staff during that?
I don't know if he was on that staff or maybe on Chris Kleiman's staff. I think he was on Chris Kleiman's staff.
Okay.
I'm not sure if he was back as far as Craig Bowl. He might have been. But they're impressive. They got a bunch of what you would describe maybe as a bunch of big farm boys, farm kids that certainly have great work ethic. And you've heard that expression, farm strong. They got a lot of guys that are farm strong. They got good mental toughness, good physicalness. They're about as big as any offensive line you'll find in F. And they have an idea of how to play. It's muscle football, and of course, they give you a chance to mix in a lot of good play action passes.
Jakob 22 wants to know Iowa not wanting to risk the 8.4 wins a season by attempting to change to a more dynamic offense. Is that got to do with some of the stubbornness that we see from Iowa offensively?
Oh, not to want to risk the 8.4 wins a season. Is that what we've averaged over, I don't know how many years?
I guess that he did the research, not me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a risk we need to take, because if the schedule's on our side, which it was this year, if defense and kicking game is playing at a very, very high level, then we've proven this year we can get to 10 wins. But can you get into the Final Four playoffs? Are you good enough to do that? Can you win a Big Ten title rather than being a runner-up? Representing the West is not enough because historically the team that represents us goes to some place other than the NCAA playoffs. Correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, the West is, so we've divided up East and West. The West has never won a Big Ten championship game. They're 0 if I'm not mistaken.
No, unless we're going to count the Wisconsin-Nebraska game that occurred before the divisions changed.
Right. Yeah, I do remember that one because I made a comment about it. I did give up 70 in the Big Ten championship game, but we gave up 42, so I guess I shouldn't say anything.
All right. I know we've answered a couple Iowa questions, but we're asking the questions that are here. So the real Hayden wants to know, what does Coach think about Jayden de Laura for Iowa's offense? And Don, please be as forthright as you want to be, because I've been extremely outspoken that I think Jayden de Laura would be excellent in Iowa's offense. I know you haven't watched a lot of him. Obviously,
is that Washington State?
Washington State. But I know you've seen a little of Jayden de Laura, and he did win the offensive freshman of the year in the conference.
Yeah. And full disclosure, Corey, I know you don't mind me saying this. You sent me a video clip of him last night. I looked at it last night and got back to you. My response was something like this. He does know how to spin a football. I think I said that to you. And I'm impressed that is he actually a first-year player? A true freshman?
I don't believe so. I'd have to look back. I don't believe so. But
anyway, in terms of eligibility, he's a freshman.
Yeah.
He's a true redshirt. It's impressive to me that a freshman could make freshman of the year at that position. And my point was it's easier to make it as a running back. It's easier to make it as a wide receiver. It's not easy to make it as a quarterback because there's a lot that goes into being a good quarterback. The fact that he's able to play that well in his first year of eligibility is impressive. And I know He's only 6'1". I think he's listed 6'1". But as you brought up, Corey, having a lot of good quarterbacks been undersized? And the answer is yeah, they have.
Especially in recent time.
Playing in the NFL right now. So that should not be a deal breaker either. But to be really fair, just to give you an idea of what I would do if I were actually considering him to be one of my quarterbacks, I'd look at a lot more than a highlight video, that's for sure. I would probably selectively look at the games against the toughest opponents, especially if it came down to one last possession, because I want to know, how does he play when the pressure's really on? Because that's when you learn a lot about a quarterback. Some guys can rise to the moment and play at the top of their game. A prime example, Aaron Rodgers, Mahomes, guys like that, Tom Brady. Other guys seem to wilt under the pressure, and you gotta be sure which one you're getting. And if a guy's got a history of falling short at that moment, then stay away from him. You got to find a guy that actually responds in that moment with his very best game. So that's what the good ones do.
If Delora, we do have a caller on hold here, so I appreciate your caller just waiting just a moment longer. But Don, I made the statement last night, if Delora checks all the boxes, and again, I'm not a QB's coach, you are a former QB's coach, so I know you don't have maybe the access to the amount of game tape that you would need to be able to properly evaluate someone like this. But if he checks all the boxes, and let's be honest, Don, he doesn't need to be Aaron Rodgers. We're talking about upgrading a QB position that has struggled all year long. So right. If he were to check all the boxes, and this is an honest question, what is the harm in reaching out to someone like this? I mean, if there's actual downside, I would like to know, because I've been saying for weeks, there's no harm in reaching out, contacting someone. We have access to phones now and social media. It's easy to contact people. So what would be the harm in reaching out if he checks the boxes?
I see no harm.
All right, let's get to our caller here. I know we have a caller on hold. Thank you for calling the Voice of College Football. Who's on the line?
Lomansky, Corey. Don reacted to a question regarding Michigan's talent against their game where they lost quite substantially, and he said it's not just talent of the players, but he talked about between the ears, maybe psychology. And I instantly, Don, just flashed back to those early days of your regime when UCLA and Nebraska came into Kinnick. And I think they're both at Kinnick. I could be wrong, but I think your regime was handling a lot of Bob Cummings talent. And those are the two early upsets where Iowa was clearly had less talent. And I'm thinking about Georgia versus Alabama. And I flashed back when you said that, because I remember watching those games, I think one in person, and that was quite the scene of being undermanned, and yet you beat them. Can you expand upon the momentum and psychology and just belief, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Coach Fry, I'll say it this way. You heard this about Bear Bryant. There's that old expression, he can take his'n and beat urine, and he can take urine and beat his'n, meaning with his players, he can beat your team. But here's the bad news for you. If you switch teams, he'd beat you then too, because he's the difference in the game. Superior coaching, at least in that description, makes all the difference. And I do think Coach Fry, it's no secret, Coach Fry was a master motivator. He was a psychology major. And the thing I've told young coaches through the years, never ever lose sight of this fact. Players do not need verbal abuse. Players fundamentally need encouragement. They need reassurance that all the hard work's going to pay off. You build them up, you don't tear them down. And I've described it this way: great coaching is hard to achieve. But here's what great coaching is. Great coaching is enabling players to play better than what they could even imagine. And that's hard to do, but that's what you aspire to do. That's what Hayden Fry aspired to do. And every now and then you felt like you got it done. How else could you explain some of the upsets we had years ago when our talent level was not that high? It's simply because our guys were better between the years than the other team. That had a lot to do with it.
Don, you'll find this interesting that both you and Corey teach people stuff, but I coached 4th, 5th, and 6th grade basketball, the same kids for 3 years. And we played a team by Northwood, Iowa, and we used to get beat by 25 points. one of the last times we played them in 6th grade, my kids came out for the second half and we were down. And I really never laid into them. And I just laid into them and I said, it's all in your guys' head. Get out there and play tougher and get it out of your head because you can beat these guys. And about half the guys looked at me like I was nuts. And there's a couple of kids, that went out there enthusiasm. And the school superintendent's kid on the first tip, he was behind this guy for a breakaway layup, and he KO'd this guy into the mat. And he's laying on the floor, and I ran out there because I thought he was hurt, and here the superintendent was behind me and his mother. And the kid looks up at me, and I said, do you want to go out of the game? He says, no, I want to win. And I said, are you hurt? And he says, yeah, but don't take me out. And we beat that team by 25 points. Thanks for your time tonight, fellas.
Thanks, Lemansky. Appreciate the calls as always. Great story there. And Don, Kenneth Sawyer wants to know, what would you use to attract a player to Iowa? And since we're talking about the playoff, just anybody, anywhere, NIL money. How I know you have been out of the game for a while, as Kenneth says here, but NIL is a new facet. Have you given thought to how you would use that, or if you would use it? I feel like you'd kind of have to in this day and age, Don.
I don't know. The whole thing disgusts me. Here's what's so frustrating. NIL money, as you're aware, our All-American center, he raised money this year, or he made money, if you will, as part of the NIL agreement that he had, some kind of T-shirts or whatnot. All of that money, as I understand it, Corey, all that money went to the Children's Hospital. $30,000. He didn't put a dime of it in his pocket because he recognized, I've already got a scholarship. I love the University of Iowa. I don't need to leave Iowa with this $30,000. It's more appropriate that it go to the Children's Hospital. Of course, I guess it maybe helps that he knows he's going to be able to earn good money in the pros. But the bottom line, it's unfortunate that this NIL thing's even come up. And I think we've discussed it some in the past, Corey. You've heard me say, I think at least off the air, I don't blame the players. I don't even blame the coaches either. It's not their fault. I blame the NCAA because maybe 10 years ago or maybe further back in time, somebody at the NCAA level should have had the vision to address this. Coaches' salaries are going up exponentially. Why don't we find some way to let the players share in all this money that we're taking in? Wouldn't it be okay if the coaches made half as much money and the players all got more than just the value of a scholarship, maybe the value of a scholarship plus $5,000 in a year? $5,000 per player would have gone a long way back in those days. And maybe 5,000 is not the right number. Maybe it's 1,000. Maybe it's 2,000. But the point is, let the players feel like they're sharing in the rewards. It's really unfair that all that money goes to coaches. Back in my day, we were not overpaid. We were underpaid. None of us cared because we love the game of football. We never did it for the money anyway. And I'm not suggesting that all coaches do it for the money now, but I am suggesting that it's kind of crazy the way coaches are paid, and the players haven't been able to benefit from all this increased revenue compared to the coaches. And that's why we're in this mess now with the NIL.
All right, let's get to our next caller. You're on the air.
Coach Don, it is an honor. I just want to say that you are ancient and you belong in a nursing home.
All right. I'll tell you what. Here's what we're going to do, bud. You call back again. We're going to block your number. All right. Not going to have it on here. We're going to block you in the chat. So when you listen to the show, you're going to do so with respect. You're not going to call this show and get nasty. All right. Been patient with you. Been patient with your questions, but I'm not going to deal with it. All right. I know Mark Rogers is not going to deal with it. You're on his channel. This is his show. So do so with courtesy and respect. I'm not going to deal with that again. So apologize to everybody who has to listen to a troll this evening, but we're moving on. Okay. Let's get to a question here. Where is it here? Somebody wanted to know about, I think it was Erica wanted to know specifically about the quarterback position, Don. And I know you've talked about it. Maybe you don't have a great answer. We talked about Delora, but Erica says, I would like to hear Coach's thoughts on who Iowa should try to get for quarterback from the portal. Don, do you have any thoughts on that? I know a lot of these guys are off the board.
I was going to say, Corey, you're more the expert of who's already found a home. sad to say, there have been a lot of good quarterbacks that have transferred to another school, and I don't know that we've reached out to any of them. I'd like to believe we did. It doesn't cost anything to inquire. The guy that made an impression on me was the A&M quarterback that had a lot to do with beating Alabama. He was a backup, as you know. The starter had gotten injured. He came in, he played really well. He had a lot to do with the win. They didn't win in spite of him. They won in part because of him. I guess he's moved on, and to my knowledge, we didn't make an attempt on him. But I would simply state that we're kind of crazy not to consider these guys, because the reality is we don't have any guarantees that we're going to keep Spencer and Alex for next fall either. So the bottom line, there's no job security as far as your roster goes. There's no guarantee you're going to be able to keep your roster intact for what it is today. Let's face it, it might change tomorrow. And if it doesn't change tomorrow, it might change at the end of spring ball. So it's the Wild Wild West. And if you can get a better player to join your team, then you're kind of crazy not to do it. As I understand it, Nebraska's got a good one coming in. Is that true?
Casey Thompson, starter at Texas.
Yeah, last time I checked, he played pretty well for Texas too, didn't he?
He played pretty well for Texas. And let's be honest, Nebraska has had no problem making it public that they've been going after quarterbacks. They contacted Burmeister from Virginia Tech. They contacted Thompson. I think they contacted just about everybody out there. Keaton Slovis was mentioned with Nebraska for a while. So, yeah, I think if Iowa is contacting quarterbacks, they're sure keeping it on the down low. I don't believe that's happening, Don. I don't believe anybody's being contacted. That's just would be I don't know. I'm not there behind the scenes, but my guess is that something would leak out by now, and I've said that on the air before. And Hummus Hero, appreciate this comment. Noted and done. So we're not gonna deal with it tonight. Seek Truth. It's a silly thought, but what if we took all this extra money and made a college? Am I reading that right? College is spelled wrong here, but I'm assuming he's talking about NIL money. Tyler Linderbaum's a perfect example of using NIL money for good. Don, there is some good that can come from this if people were to follow the example of that young man, who's going to be making millions next year if he goes pro. We recognize that. I mean,
right.
But it's still a generous thing to do for someone who, that's a lot of money for a 22-year-old kid, a 21-year-old, however old Tyler Linderbaum is, to have access to that early in life and in college.
Yeah, very true.
All right. I think we're caught up on the questions. Appreciate everybody listening here. And John, maybe this can be the last question. Second to last question. I see one from Austin. John says, has Coach heard anything on Joey Labus? Is there anything behind the rumblings that he's been performing well in practice? So we've kind of segued from the championship game tomorrow to Iowa. But Don, have you heard anything about Joey Labus?
I have not. And unless I heard it directly from one of the coaches or one of the players that's been in the program a long time, I wouldn't put any stock in it. So I simply haven't heard. But I do know this. If Labus is a scout team quarterback, and I think he fundamentally was a scout team quarterback throughout the year, I do think in part of this bowl season preparation that he did take some reps on the varsity end of the field, because there were days maybe where Spencer wasn't taking reps, or maybe Alex wasn't for one reason or another. So I do think he got some quality reps in preparation for the bowl game, and I don't doubt that he looked good in those. But I've just seen too often through the years somebody raving about a guy on the scout team, but you got to realize a guy on the scout team is reading the card. There's really no pressure on him compared to performing on the varsity end of the field. He's kind of freewheeling, because he's simply responding to plays that are drawn up on a card. And even if he does look good as a scout team quarterback, that's no guarantee that he can do it in front of a crowd on Saturday. So until you see him in front of a game crowd, it's really hard to know what you're going to get.
All right. Don, final question from Austin. He says, what is the negative in using the transfer portal? I know that the ideal situation, and Kirk has talked about this, bringing a guy in out of high school and being able to shape him and have him for 4 to 5 years, possibly even 6 during the COVID era. But what is the negative in using the transfer portal? And I sense a little bit of frustration that Iowa hasn't been in the portal at quarterback. I sensed a lot of that last night. but just in general, maybe Iowa a bit hesitant to use it. I know they have used it in the past and successfully. Charlie Jones, Zach Van Valkenburg are two excellent examples, but there seems to still be some hesitancy. Why might that be?
I don't know. The team that comes to mind for me first and foremost is our bowl opponent. Where would Kentucky have been this year without their quarterback and their transfer wide receiver? Those two guys alone made a huge difference in the Kentucky team. So I think you're kind of foolish, at least not to actively evaluate what's in the portal and, to have an open mind about how your roster might be changing in the months ahead. Obviously, a good example this year would be Clemson. Dabo Swinney made it clear he was not a fan of the transfer portal, and he had no interest in players coming in. The bad news for Clemson, I think they lost about 20 players. And obviously, if you're losing players, you need to be replacing them. And there's no way you can do it just with new signees coming in from high school. You need some older players that are better positioned to help you immediately. And I think that's one reason Clemson fell back a little bit this year. They still played good defense, but their offense was not up to the usual Clemson standards.
Still won 10 games, Don.
Yeah. Well, they won 10 kind of like we did. It was kind of ugly.
Yeah, a little bit, but ended on a good note, and Iowa did not. I'll give them that. John, appreciate this. Thanks for a great year, Don. You made it extra fun. You too, Corey. Thank you, John, and thank you to everybody. And Don, do we want to do one final wrap-up show to the season at some point? Are we done?
We can do that. Let me mention to you, Corey, something we talked about today earlier, getting back to analytics. As you've already heard me say, I'm a little uncomfortable sharing everything I know tonight. I didn't think I would be, but the fact that Alabama won these top 5 parameters, I don't really want to mention what they all are tonight, because I think that would be, if Alabama already knows what they are and Georgia doesn't, then that's on Georgia. If Alabama's figured it out and they haven't, that's just part of game planning again, is to know all the facts. So I'm not prepared to give all that information out tonight. But as you mentioned, Corey, one thing we could do is simply have a short taping tomorrow, or tape it tonight for that matter, whatever is good for you, to divulge this information, but to divulge it only shortly before kickoff. I'm more than comfortable doing that. I think it might make the game more interesting for the fans, even the Alabama and Georgia fans. I would imagine they're really interested in knowing what these parameters are that seem to matter the most.
Don, I know just our conversations with you throughout the season, my conversations with you throughout the season made watching Iowa football even more enjoyable, because I was sitting there in the Big Ten championship game saying, all right, second, or whatever game it was, second quarter scoring, can Iowa win the second quarter? The toss. I told you how emotionally frustrated I was when Iowa deferred to the second half in that Big Ten championship game. And, people who were watching it with me are looking at me like, what are you getting so upset? It's a coin toss. And and I was upset about it. So no, it does change how you view a football game. Yeah. So, Don, why don't we do this? And for everybody listening, if you're interested in the top 5 parameters, right? We're going to go top 5, Don.
Yeah.
The top 5 parameters that are essential to victory that happen to all be won by Alabama, which is really outstanding, astounding to think about. They were all won by Alabama in the SEC title game. We are going to release those top 5 parameters. We'll say 6:30 p.m. Central Time, so half an hour before kickoff time. So if you're invested in this game, you're looking forward to it, be sure to tune in right here to the Voice of College Football. We'll probably post it on the main channel. I haven't talked to Mark about that, but likely not on the Iowa channel. So it will be on the main Voice of College Football channel. Top 5 parameters essential to victory between Georgia and Alabama. And feel free, again, it's going to be a shorter video, maybe 10 minutes long. Again, we'll release it at 6:30 Central Time, a half hour before kickoff. And I would follow along, and it makes the game more exciting to be able to watch it with those stats and those analytics in mind. So
I'll make a bold prediction, Corey. If Alabama wins those same 5 parameters, they'll win again. They may not even take all 5, but if somebody wins 4 out of 5, they'll probably win the game.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, I don't have maybe you have the data on that, Don, but thinking back to Iowa's schedule and their 14 games, was there ever a time where the winner of any of Iowa's games won the top 5 parameters?
I have to go back and check. I'm not sure. Probably not.
Yeah, that is a very, very impressive stat. So I'm intrigued by that. I'll look forward to hearing. And just for the record, for anybody,
maybe Wisconsin did. I don't know. Maybe Wisconsin did. I don't think Purdue did, but maybe Wisconsin.
By the way, somebody asked in the chat earlier, is Purdue an air raid or are they just an air raid against Iowa? They're an air raid when Xander Horvath was out. They did basically nothing on the ground. They had one scholarship running back, I believe, for that Iowa game. That was King Doru, and he really didn't do a whole lot.
They're that rare commodity that can actually win with a primarily pass offense. They run just to keep you honest.
Absolutely. Okay. All right, Don. Well, again, appreciate it as always. A reminder to everybody that I don't know how you wouldn't know this already. It's the biggest game of the year. The College Football Playoff National Championship game tomorrow night, Monday night, 7 p.m. Central Time. Of course, it'll be on ESPN. Mark Rogers will have you covered. I know he'll be on after the game, taking calls, talking about the game. I'm sure it's going to be a busy night on this channel. But if you want to listen to this preview back, if you missed part of it or you want to share it with a friend, be sure to follow our podcast, From the Hawkeye of the Storm. I'm going to throw it up there on the bottom line, the bottom ticker. From the Hawkeye of the Storm, our podcast available through Spotify, Apple, Google, and more. I will post this show in maybe an hour. It should be up within the hour. You'll be able to listen to it over the next 24 hours. And again, stay tuned because the top 5 parameters, the analytics essential to victory in this game will be posted to this channel, to the Voice of College Football channel, rather, at 6:30 p.m. Central Time in anticipation of the game. And Don, I just want to thank you. I know we're hopefully we can do a season wrap-up show, and specifically on Iowa. I know we spent a lot of time on a variety of subjects tonight, specifically the Georgia-Bama matchup, but hopefully we can do a wrap-up show for Iowa now that we've had time to sort of decompress, and certainly once Bama and Georgia goes final. But I do want to thank you for the many hours you spent with this show, with our callers, with our commenters. I know I can speak on behalf of the hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of people that listen. Thank you for everything you've done. We certainly, I know I can say I certainly appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Corey. It's a labor of love. You know that. I love the game of college football, and I certainly specifically love the University of Iowa.
All right, folks, on that awesome note, we will talk to you soon. Enjoy the college football playoff tomorrow, and tune back into the Iowa channel right here at Iowa with the Voice of College Football Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. for our next edition of Iowa Live. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.